Fantastic. Thank you so much, Volker, for this very nice introduction. That's very nice to hear. And I'm super happy to be here, participate in this talk series that I like to frequent often. So I really appreciate this. And I'm looking forward to present to all of you this paper on competition and value capture in platform markets and its implications for complementary strategy. This is joint work with Ambre Nicolle, who is at LMU Munich, at the same institution where I did my PhD. And she's also in the audience today. And, please note that this is a work in progress. So have this in mind. And, if you have questions, comments, we're very happy to hear them because we're still developing part of this, of course. And broadly speaking, this paper is about an increase in competition in a platform market, so at the platform level. And we're interested in how this increase, which is caused by a new entrant into this platform market, how this has implications for the relationship of the incumbent platform with their complementors. So why do we think this is an interesting topic to study? Well, as most of you probably know, multi-sided platforms can grow really, really large. They're subject to network effects, economies of scale and adoption, and so these can grow pretty significantly and exponentially. And that's good for both complementors who go there to supply complementary products, but also consumers there because, this maximizes the value for everybody, right? So the more complementors are there, the more, choices consumers have to transact with, and the more consumers are there, then complementors like app developers, for example, have a great opportunity to actually turn a profit there. So that's great. At the same time, we also know that being large players means that they can grow into really dominant, powerful position, especially vis-a-vis the complementary firms that are part of the ecosystems. And we know by now that they use this position to extract much of the value that the complementors actually bring to the platform and co-create with the platform owner, right? So they enter profitable niches in their own marketplaces, they impose unfair revenue sharing schemes and things like this. And kind of this, of course, creates tensions in the relationship between a platform owner that is dominant and large and the complementors that don't like this at all. And we've seen a recent, resurgence of some regulation at the EU level, for example, with the DMA, but also some legal challenges of complementors kind of suing dominant platform owners. And when we think about tensions in the relationship between the two, let's talk about this a little bit. So this relationship is kind of characterized by, two opposing things. First, it's characterized by cooperation between the platform owner and the complementer. Right, so they have strong incentives to kind of align their goals and kind of jointly bake and grow this proverbial pie, if you will. And both the platform owner and complementer have distinct roles in this relationship. So the platform owner makes sure that complementors can transact with the consumers. They set certain rules and deploy certain nudges to make sure that all participants kind of pull in the same direction and goals are aligned. And the complementer is very much, they supply complementary products and services, but they can actually do a little bit more, right? So they can do little extra investments in technological complementarity, making sure that, for example, an app works well with a smartphone. They have some agency to what extent they adhere to the rules and kind of nudges that the platform owner deploys to align incentives. And what we also see in some instances is that complementors actually engage in exclusivity agreements with certain platform owners to strengthen their competitive position when they face competition. So they cooperate when they grow this pie together, but on the other hand, we see tension arising when it comes to value capture. So basically, incentives become very much misaligned when we think about who gets what, slice of this proverbial pie, right? And on digital platforms, this is usually governed by revenue sharing agreements. The platform owner can deploy algorithms or promotional activities to kind of steer demand towards certain complementors, or complementors and platform owners can hammer out sweetheart deals to kind of steer demand and things like this. And kind of the source of tension on dominant platforms, of course, is that the owner can use their powerful position to impose these mechanisms as take it or leave it offers. right? So they can propose, for example, an unfair revenue sharing mechanism to complementors, and the complementors have no choice but to accept it or not become active in any market at all. And this is kind of the point of departure for our paper. We kind of say, okay, platform dominance clearly shapes these relationships to some extent. But what then happens when a competing platform enters the same market and kind of challenges the dominance of the incumbent? And it's kind of an open question still of how complementors of the incumbent would react to such a rival. And what we're particularly interested in is how they react in terms of their cooperative value co-creation with the incumbent, right? These optional investments in complementarity, to what extent they adhere to rules and design features and things like this. And ex ante, it's not so clear how these incentives are affected by an increase in platform level competition, because, as I said, on the one hand, the dominant platform is large, generates a lot of network benefits, and that's very good for complementors, so they would like that. On the other hand, dominant platforms abuse their position, and that's bad for complementors. So it's not clear how incentives to cooperate with the incumbent are affected. So we ask this research question right here: how does the entry of a rival platform affect the cooperation of complementors with the incumbent? And in particular, we're looking at two cooperative or non-cooperative choices. So first, we're interested which of the complementors that have been active on the incumbent also join the new entrant or the rival. And we say this is non-cooperation because it strengthens and helps the rival as opposed to the incumbent. And we're interested in how their responsiveness to orchestration attempts by the incumbent changes. So when the incumbent proposes a rule or wants to nudge them some way, do they react to this? Do they adhere to this? And doing so is an act of cooperation because it serves to align goals and activities with the incumbent owner. And then very important in our setting and our framework as well is that this will be determined by heterogeneous characteristics across different complementors. So to give you a brief overview of the paper, so the empirical context that we study is the video game developer Epic Games entering the market for PC video game distribution in late 2018. So what they did, they launched a digital marketplace where game developers can sell their games, and thereby becoming a new competitor to the dominant incumbent that has been Steam. And we're looking at two choices game developers of Steam then have to make. Okay, one choice, do I join the Epic Games Store or not? And then in terms of this orchestration attempts, we're looking at their participation in Steam's sales promotions, which I will describe over the talk, constitute a salient orchestration attempt by the incumbent platform. In terms of theory, we take a look through the lens of value capture theory and kind of posit that the entry has a demand side effect and an outside effect on complementary value capture on the incumbent. The idea here being that the entrant comes in, competes away consumers from the incumbent. This reduces the demand on the incumbent and thereby threatens kind of the profitability of the complementors there. So it's detrimental for them, all else equal. And the outside option effect opposing this is that complementors, of course, also gain an alternative to sell their product on. And this has then opposing implications for their continued cooperation incentives with the incumbent. And then we say, all the complementors on Steam or the incumbent are affected by both effects, but the extent to which they are will be determined by heterogeneity. And we're looking at complementaries' bargaining ability, their reliance on network effects, and whether or not they use the entrant's technology kind of as boundary decisions, conditions that determine which of the two effects will be dominant. And kind of the analysis and key findings, we have a two-part analysis. In both, we kind of estimate the difference in outcomes between those different complementary types, both in terms of who joined VGS, which is the one part, and then how do they react to orchestration attempts continuously is the other part. And we operationalize this by making a distinction between indie versus major developers, which has to do with bargaining ability, multiplayer versus single-player games, which has to do with reliance on network effects, and then whether or not they use the Unreal Engine, which is proprietary technology by the entrant. And then indeed our findings are that those who are indeed primarily hurt via this demand side effect, they increase cooperation with the incumbent post-entry in an effort to kind of push back and protect their demand there. And those who rather find an attractive outside option in the entrant, they lower their cooperation with the incumbent because, you know, they value the new value creation opportunity in the entrant. So that's basically the story in a nutshell. Now let me start by telling you a little bit about our empirical background. So the setting we're studying is digital distribution of PC video games, and for many, many years now, PC video games are very much sold and distributed via digital marketplaces, right? So these marketplaces, there are platforms that connect game developers with consumers, but they also provide some additional services. They kind of manage the installation of games. They make sure that consumers can play together in multiplayer games. They have review and recommendation systems and stuff like this. And then nowadays we have two players, but for the longest time we had pretty much one single dominant incumbent player, and that was Steam. And you see it here. And so this platform or marketplace really had a near monopoly for the longest time until 2018, around 70% market share, up to 150 million active monthly users. So really, really big and dominating the market. However, this was kind of contested a little bit in December 2018 when Epic Games launched its own store as a direct competitor, right? You see it here. It's basically a very, very similar marketplace or storefront that they released as a direct competitor. And they were a little bit sneaky about how they did this. They announced this at the 4th of December 2018. They actually launched the thing on the 6th of December with a very limited set of games available initially. And this is how they did this. But Epic Games itself, they're not a new player in the industry per se, but they have been a well-known game developer since, you know, more than 30 years now. And most well-known they are, of course, for their popular game Fortnite. So if any of you has kind of teenage kids at home, chances are they're playing this right now. It's like super immensely popular. And what they're also known for is that they develop and own the Unreal Engine. So this is a very popular tool that is used in game development, and they license this tool out to other game developers in exchange for a licensing fee of 5%. So, you know, a third party can use this, build a game with it, and when they then generate revenues, they have to pay 5% of those revenues to Epic Games. So these are the two things they're kind of known for in the industry. And then we can talk a little bit about Epic's entry strategy. And really the most prominent feature, let's say, was that they wanted to challenge Steam's revenue sharing system, right? So the main mechanism that governs value capture on these platforms. And to give you some insights, so on Steam, since December 2018, what a coincidence, they have adopted a tiered revenue sharing system where that governs the cut in terms of percentage what the platform takes when a game that is being sold there generates revenues. And the cut it takes kind of goes down as revenues increase. So it goes down from 30% if it has less than 10 million in revenues, and it goes down to 20% when a game achieves more than 50 revenues. So it's like this tiered system that, you know, clearly favors large, highly popular players, because 50 million in revenues, that's a hefty sum for game developers to attain. And actually before December 2018, which is the month that Epic entered the market, they just used a flat 30%. And, you know, Epic kind of said, you know what, we can do way better than this, right? 30%, that's way too much. Guess what, we're gonna take 12, no matter what. Whether you're a large player or a small player, we're gonna take 12%. So much more favorable deal for all game developers. And in addition, what they also did, they kind of leveraged the fact that they own the Unreal Engine and have a lot of other game developers that use this by saying, you know, when you use our technology, normally we would take 5% of your revenues. But if you choose to sell your game through our store, then we're going to waive these 5% for you, right? So for this type of game developer, it becomes even more favorable. And you can see the overview of the split here. This is actually from Epic Games' own marketing material. And basically the takeaway is that for a game developer, if they sell through Steam, they only get to keep 65 or 70% of the revenues they generate. But when they go to the new entrant, to Epic Games Store, they get to always keep 88%. So this is kind of the main value proposition that they pose for the game developers. And now we know that this entry exercise was kind of successful. So here you kind of see the development of, let's say, a proxy for consumer numbers, and Steam remained the larger player. They're still the largest and probably also dominant, but Epic Games has managed since 2019 to actually also grab a quite decent share of the market. And then let me tell you about the complementary choices that we then study. In front of this backdrop, first, as I told you, very straightforwardly, we're asking which of the game developers that are on Steam also then become available on the Epic Games Store. Very straightforward. We call this an act of non-cooperation, kind of in keeping with our conceptual framework that I'm going to tell you about in a second. And we say it's non-cooperation because it kind of hurts Steam and helps the entrant. And then perhaps a little bit less straightforward is we look at game developers' participation in Steam's sale promotions. So what Steam does, multiple times per week, kind of semi-regular, they organize these sales promotions, like, for example, a summer sale or a Halloween sale or something like this. And then the platform says to its game developers via email, we're doing a summer sale. It would be great if you could all jointly discount your games here, so that we can attract a lot of eyeballs to our marketplace, right? And this is why we call this Steam's most salient orchestration attempt, because it really serves to coordinate or orchestrate these discounts in terms of timing across a lot of game developers. And this needs some coordination because game developers, they can in principle always discount their games, right? So they have complete agency when they do it. And here they're basically asked to do it while everybody else is doing it in the same marketplace, right? So this is why we call this an orchestration attempt. And doing so, we say, is cooperative complementary behavior because it helps Steam's competitive standing, because when a lot of they coordinatedly discount their games, this creates a period of high demand, and it's a good thing for the platform. Right. Does it make sense to, are there any questions in the chat or something so far? No? Very good. All right. So this is kind of the empirical background that we're thinking about. Now let me tell you a little bit about how we think about this conceptually. So on the paper, we have a very, very simple theoretical model where we kind of model how the entry affects the complementor's ability to capture value on the incumbent. And we kind of say, the implications for their ability to capture value on the incumbent will then drive their subsequent cooperation choices. Let me give you here just the main idea behind this. So on the one hand, we say there's this demand side effect that arises because some fraction of consumers from the incumbent will switch to the entrant. This will lower the demand on the incumbent, and then, of course, kind of threatens the complementor's profitability there. So they cannot sell as much as they could have before. And then, all else equal, this creates the incentive for complementors to actually strengthen the incumbent's position, right? Because if they do this, then they, in so doing, protect their own demand there, the value they can create, and the value they can capture. And on the other hand, we have this outside option effect that arises because complementors, of course, can also go to the other platform and sell there. And then when they expect this to be more profitable for them, and they sense a better deal there, this creates an incentive for them, of course, to move some of the value creation activities to the entrant. So for one, that's a thing. But in addition, we kind of say, seeing a potentially better deal on the entrant may actually breed discontentment over the situation on the incumbent as well, just by saying, okay, why can't we get an as good a deal on the incumbent where we already are when there's a new entrant, right? So this is perhaps a more behavioral aspect that we kind of have in mind. And then when we think about complementary cooperation, these two effects have opposing implications, right? So the demand side effect, because it threatens the demand on the incumbent and complementors value capture there, it creates an incentive to increase complementary cooperation with the incumbent in an effort to push back against the entrant, whereas the outside option effect should create incentives to decrease complementary cooperation for the reasons that I basically just taught you. And then we say, you know, all the complementors are affected by both effects, but the degree to which they may be affected by those effects may not be equal, right? This may be subject to heterogeneity, and we explore a few characteristics here. So we look at complementors' bargaining ability, the reliance on network effects, and whether or not they use the entrance technology with it, which in our case is the Unreal Engine. And then kind of to form this idea into testable predictions, we kind of derive what we call empirical hypotheses. And the idea here is really, we ask ourselves, how does the entry affect the value capture of different complementary types? And how would they then react to this in terms of their cooperation with the incumbent? Now I'm just going to give you the headline of the mechanism that we have in mind, but also how we then operationalize this in our empirical setting. So first, when we look at the bargaining ability, really the idea here is, and this comes out from the model as well, that if you have a complementer with a really strong bargaining ability, then this enables them to capture a really large share of value on the incumbent, right? So you could think about the large pie of value co-creation on the incumbent. If a complementer gets a huge piece of that pie, then the demand side effect should be higher, because if the overall pie shrinks, then this high bargaining ability are just more detrimentally affected by this. And empirically, we make then the distinction between indie and major developers. And the idea here is that indie developers really are low bargaining ability complementers, because as opposed to these major or AAA developers, they don't have large legal departments or marketing departments that would enable them to engage in negotiations with platform owners for a high value capture share. So the idea is indie developers being small, they only capture a very, very small piece of the pie. And then if the overall pie shrinks, it doesn't matter for them too much in absolute terms. And so the first set of empirical hypotheses is that we would expect indie developers to be more likely to join the entrant, because the grass is very much greener for them there. And in terms of their continued participation in these sales periods, we would expect them to be less likely to. And then second, we look at their reliance on network effects. So some recent study has shown that network benefits matter for all complementers, but the extent to which they matter can very much vary. And the mechanism that we have in mind here is, if you have a complementer that very much relies on network effects, this means they also rely on the incumbent size advantage. Right? The incumbent is bigger, has a lot of consumers that generate network effects. And on the flip side, the entrant that is smaller initially cannot reproduce the same network effects for them, right? And then empirically, we look at the distinction between multiplayer and single-player games, and the idea is that multiplayer games, they can be played by consumers together, so they rely on product-level network effects. So they really rely on a large platform for this to materialize. So the second set of empirical hypotheses is that we would expect multiplayer games to be less likely to join the entrant, but more likely to participate in these sales promotions to increase their cooperation with the incumbent. And then lastly, we look at the use of the entrance technology. And really the mechanism that we have in mind here has to do with platform envelopment. If you know the paper by Eisman, Parker and Van Elstein from 2011, and the idea basically is, if a firm already has an installed base of technology users, then it can leverage this installed base, which is a very much captive audience to some extent, to also adopt this platform. Right? So they have this captive audience, they can say, oh, well, you can also join our platform, and they will have an easier time to convince them than other types of complementers. That's kind of the idea and mechanism behind this. And empirically, we of course see that Epic Games is doing exactly this with their Unreal Engine by waiving the royalty fee on that when it's the game is sold through their store. And this is why we make this empirical distinctions between games that use this technology with those that use some other type of technology. And here, the empirical hypothesis is that we would expect that Unreal Engine games are more likely to join the entrant, but less likely to participate in Steam sales promotions after the entry. All right. So then I can show you a little bit about our data. So our data comes from multiple sources. We have information about roughly 10,000 games that are available on Steam. We scrape this in part from Steam's API, but also some third-party websites that themselves continuously scrape the API and are able to provide additional time-varying data. So we get a lot of game characteristics, who developed the game, what is the genre, and things like this. We also have information about Steam reviews, so how often has a game been reviewed, how positive have these reviews been, which we kind of use as a proxy for quality and popularity in our empirics. We have information about prices and discounts over time. Here we focus on this information in the US store. And crucially, this also includes information about whether these discounts happen during game sales promotions, which lets us, of course, track their participation. And then we have some information about player numbers over time, which we can also use to get at popularity. We also scraped information from the Epic Games Store directly, similar information in terms of characteristics, but what we mainly use it for is to kind of identify those Steam games that also joined the entrant platform. And we kind of complement this with data from movigames.com, where we get information about development team size, which kind of proxies for production value or production costs of a game. And this lets us really identify which games use Epic Games' Unreal Engine in the development. And then in terms of how many of these actually did join the Epic Games Store, so what you see here is kind of the overlap between the two stores. We have like roughly 10,000 games available on Steam, roughly 2,000 available on the Epic Games Store, and the overlap between the two is 6%. So it's not enormous, but it's something. And in our study, we focus on this subset you see right now because we're interested in the actions of the incumbents complementors. And then some background on Steam sales promotions. So what you see here is the share of participating games in each sales promotion. So for example, when you look at the winter sale 2017, which is the second from the top, from our data, 75% of all games discounted their price during this time, right? So basically it gives you an indication of how popular different types or different game sales promotions are. And the takeaway from this is, well, there's quite some heterogeneity, right? So some sales promotions are highly popular, a lot of game developers participate, and others are not. For example, you have a Games from Norway sale, and being in Norway, there's not many games here, right? And we have to kind of account for these things empirically, of course. And we add some additional analysis about this as well, in fact. So then we can move on to our first part of analysis and the results. So again, we have this two-part analysis, and the first one is about who joins the entrant after it's entered. And here, kind of our goal is to estimate the difference of different complementer types of doing so. We have a cross-section of 8,000 games on Steam that are not developed by Steam itself, of course. Some of them are released before the entry, actually, and some after. And we have some additional analysis making this split explicit. And of course, we face a bunch of empirical challenges here, right? First of all, joining the entry is very much a one-off decision, right? They make this once. And this kind of forces us to rely on a cross-sectional analysis here. So keep that in mind. And this, of course, bears the challenge that different complementer types that we have in mind, like this indie, multiplayer, and Unreal Engine thing, they vary along multiple dimensions that can determine this joining decision above and beyond the mechanisms that we describe. And here our approach to kind of address this is a combination of many control variables, some fixed effects, and we also do some matching as a robustness check. And when all is said is done, we estimate this logit model right here. So the coefficients of interest are the ones on indie, multiplayer, and Unreal. We have genre and release year fixed effect. So the purpose of the genre fixed effect is mainly to account for within marketplace competition, right? So if we think that games mainly face competition from similar games, then a genre fixed effect kind of controls for this, but this may, of course, otherwise also drive the decision. And then we have this huge vector of game level control variables, and they're supposed to, on the one hand, capture aspects of Steam lock-in. So we have, proxies for developers' experience with Steam, some of the programming effort that they put into being able to be on Steam, and some other things. And the other set of control variables that we use are directed at the game's popularity or its quality, right? So it's an undiscounted price as a measure for the demand that they expect. We have an average of the active player numbers as a proxy for their popularity, and some other things. So this is how the summary statistics look like. In our sample here, you can see that 7% of those Steam games join the entrant, a little more than half are indie games, 30% are multiplayer games, and only 4% use the Unreal Engine. And then our first set of main results is that indeed these indie games, these low bargaining ability complementors, they have a 2.8 percentage point higher probability to join the entrant, right? And this is conditional on their quality, popularity, and some other things. Then also, as expected, multiplayer games are 1.25 percentage points less likely because they rely on network effects. They prefer supporting the incumbent. So this is also consistent with the mechanism that we have in mind. And then again, the Unreal Engine games have a 2.76 percentage points higher likelihood to join the entrant, which is also consistent with our story. And in addition, we like to add that these relationships are also quite sizable because keeping in mind that 7% of games in our sample join the entrant, a percentage points difference of 2.7 is it's a quite significant difference. And then we have some additional results here. So we do a split between games that have been released before the launch of the Epic Games Store and those who have been released afterwards, kind of figuring out whether game developers port over old games or whether they only make fresh decisions when they release new games. We find some interesting patterns here that are provide some nuance but not much challenge to our main results. And we also look at the role of games quality and popularity. For a subsample of those who have been released before the entry, we know how often they have been reviewed and how positive these reviews were on Steam. And then we were interested to see whether different complementer types kind of join the entrant with their high demand or the high quality products. And what we kind of find that they always enter with the high quality products, regardless of complementer type. But with the high popularity products, this is only the case for indie and Unreal Engine games. And we kind of see this as supportive for our mechanisms because, when they have in mind to support the entrant, then they would, of course, join them with those products that they expect to be kind of the heavy hitters, if you will. And then our second analysis is about sales participation. So here we have a different diff style logic. So we're interested in estimating the change in the probability of a game participating in a certain promotion between before and after the entry. And then kind of the cross-sectional difference, the second difference here is between the different complementary types. So our sample here is a game sale promotion panel, which basically means that we track each game over time as it has a choice to participate in different Steam sales promotions that happen over time. We limit our sample period to a two-year window around the launch and focus on those 4,000 games that have actually been active on Steam before that launch. And we have 18 Steam sales that we have in the sample. Again, we have similar empirical challenges to solve here. Again, different complementary types, very long multiple interventions that can drive this decision. But in addition, these sales promotions, of course, are also not random events, but Steam, the incumbent platform, kind of decides when to launch them and what kind to launch them. And so they, as you have seen, they vary in the relevance for different complementary types. They may actually be a reaction to the launch of the Epic Games Store, right? And this can create issues. And so in terms of identifying this, we then use two-way fixed effects models, some time-varying controls at the game level, and we use matching, so cause and exact matching at the game level as well. And then when it's all said and done, we estimate this difference in difference style model, where the outcome of interest is a dummy indicating that a certain game participated in a certain sale. We're interested in this diff and diff term here, where we have this different treatment indicators indicating the different complementary types, and then we have our two-way fixed effects, capturing kind of the average tendency of a game to participate in the Steam sales, but also the average popularity of a Steam sale. And we have a bunch of time-varying controls, capturing additional aspects of a game's popularity, its age, and the number of competitors it actually faces within Steam at any point in time. And alternatively, we also match on these control variables, but when we match on them, we use the value that we measure at the time of the EGS launch. Here are the summary statistics. So in the average sale, we see that around 38% of the games in our sample actually discount the game, so they do participate. And in terms of the distribution across the different game complementary types, it's not that different from before. And our main results are again consistent. So after the Epic Games launch, indie games are 1.17 to 2.04 percentage points less likely to continue to participate in these sales compared to major developers. Multiplayer games are around 2.5 percentage points more likely to compared to single player games. And Unreal Engine games, here we don't find any significant difference, so no difference there. Still, we say that this is largely consistent with our conceptual story, but we also have to kind of say that these are relatively mild effects, or mild relationships that we estimate, because if the average game and the average sale, or the average sale draws 40% of participating games, then a percentage points difference of 2 is just not super large, right? But that being said, there's some nuance to this. So as a piece of additional analysis, we were interested what kind of sales promotions are driving this. Is this like this super popular ones, or more these smaller niche type sales? So what we do sample splits where we say, okay, a sale with more than 40% of participating games, we call it major sale, and all others are minor sales. And what we kind of see here, that our results that I just showed you are completely driven by those minor sales, right? And our interpretation of that is that it's kind of too juicy, let's say, for game developers to participate in these large periods like a summer sale or a winter sale, because the effect of creating this high period of demand seems to outweigh their cooperation incentives. So instead, they only react with these smaller, less popular sales. This is our interpretation here. And then kind of as an additional piece of analysis, we were wondering, well, does this have to do with orchestration at all? Does it have to do with the sales promotions at all? Or does it more have something to do with discounting games in general, right? And kind of what we do here, we have a weekly panel of games. And we exclude all the weeks where sales promotions are going on, and we're kind of estimating a dummy that indicates that a game gets discounted in these weeks outside sales promotions, and we find no difference here, right? So it does not seem to be just a story about discounting games, but we are convinced that this is really about reacting to orchestration attempts. And that's basically the the main set of results that I have for you and that I wanted to show you. So now to move on to the discussion. First, we like to think that our results provide support for our conceptual predictions. So we described this demand side effect that kind of threatens complementors' profitability on the incumbent. So they would increase their cooperation with the incumbent to push back, and this is what we find. With the outside option effect, we said that this creates incentives to decrease cooperation with the incumbent, and this is also what we find. And both of these effects drive the decisions about which platforms to join, but also to what extent to respond to orchestration attempts. Some implications. Number one, complementary heterogeneity matters, right? So there's not one uniform effect, we would argue, of the entrant, but it's just the matter that some complementers prefer dealing with a larger platform, even though it has a powerful position that it can use against them, whereas other types of complementers, they welcome an outside option. Right, so it depends. It also has implications for successful entry into platform markets, right? This is challenging for new players, of course. In particular, our findings support the idea of divide and conquer strategies, which basically means if a new platform wants to enter a market, they should try and figure out which type of complementers may be especially susceptible to being lured away to get like the network effects ball going. And then, I'm going back to the initial motivation. We were wondering whether our results show that increased platform level competition can actually empower complementers. And we say, yes, seems to be the case. And why we think this is, for one, when we look at these major developers, like the large bargaining ability developers, they actually, as a first order effect, got a more favorable deal by Steam, right? And this then ensured their continued cooperation. Whereas those indie developers, those low bargaining ability complementers, they didn't get a better deal, but they then gained agency in terms of, going to an alternative platform or, adhering to these orchestration attempts. And when we talk about limits, what we have in mind is the reliance on network effects. So we see that that those multiplayer games, they still prefer the larger incumbent. And kind of the takeaway here in terms of empowerment is that an entrant will have a very hard time to kind of reproduce the same level of network benefits for them. Then in terms of contributions, we like to think we make a contribution to the discussion around platform competition and governance, right? We show how between platform competition relates to some of the strategic choices complementers make. We like to think that we provide some novel insights about determinants of multi-homing, so complementers joining multiple platforms, and in particular, we illuminate the role of value capture mechanisms. And then we show that platform-level competition can actually be a determinant of the effectiveness of orchestration attempts. We also like to think that we make a contribution to value capture theory. So the theory talked about competition in the past, but there was not much empirics about this, and we actually provide an empirical test about the role of competition in interfirm cooperation. And then, of course, we have a bunch of limitations. Right? So we only study reactions by complementers on the incumbent. But in reality, the market structure is a little bit more complex. There are, for example, direct channels that certain developers have, and there are some niche platforms also active in the market that we don't have data on. Then we study two very specific complementor choices, who joins and how do they change their responsiveness to orchestration attempts. But, they do a plethora of additional choices, which, further studies can explore if they want. And we treat the decision to join the entrant and their responsiveness to orchestration attempts as independent in our study. But, in truth, they may be interrelated, right? We kind of looked into this, but we did not really find any meaningful boundary conditions here. And that's basically what I have for you. Thank you so much for the attention. And yeah, I'm looking forward to Q&A, questions, comments. And please don't hold back. This is in development. Yeah, that's that.